Hi everyone, we're back. This is season 2, and we're starting season 2 with Alisa Zavialova. She's the founder of the Calgary Essential Language Solutions, which is a language school for English as a second language, for French as a second language, for Spanish as a second language, mostly focusing on adults. She's a second language educator in general and a newcomer integration professional. Alisa, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure to see you here. And I think what we're going to talk today is very important for the audience. Language skills. We know that there's a lot of issues that people are afraid to talk sometimes. When they just immigrate, they may have reservations somewhere. But I think what we will discuss with you today is going to be very important for them to overcome those challenges.
I hope so, yeah.
But let's start with you. What was the hardest moment for yourself when you immigrated to Canada? Because you're an immigrant as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm an immigrant and I speak English as my second language. I'm not hiding it. I am very proud of my heritage. I'm Ukrainian-Canadian. So I speak several languages in addition to English. When I first came to Canada, that was back in 2012, and I initially moved to Ottawa, Ontario. So that's where I went to grad school. So I finished my master's degree and then completed my PhD degree in second language studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. I would say the hardest was paying my bills because as an international student, I had to pay very high tuition fees. Thankfully, I did have some partial scholarship from the university, but it wasn't enough to cover the entire tuition fee. And so because, grad school takes some time to complete. So it was the first 2 years, I would say, just like struggling financially. And at that time, we weren't allowed as international students to work off campus for the first 6 months. So I had to look for opportunities working as a research assistant, and thankfully I had some opportunities at the university at that time. And then it, took me some time to gradually, when I was allowed to finally work off campus. So I actually started teaching English as a second language almost from day one, right, in Canada, which was also my background from back home. But then my Canadian university allowed me to get right into this industry here. But financially, paying the bills, paying tuition was tough, for sure.
Of course, when you're a student, it's always hard.
Yeah.
And it's good that you have that opportunity with a scholarship. Mm-hmm. But it's a big step, right? Like from being a student, now you're a doctor. Mm-hmm. And you were very focused on the academia part of things. So what kind of motivated you to go from academia and from working in the universities to actually starting your own school?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So when I first arrived, I kind of saw myself, building my career in academia, as you said, right? So I was working towards my tenure track position. And then when the pandemic started, a lot of things changed in our industry, specifically in teaching second language to adults in Canada. And traditionally in Canada, this industry has been, supported so to speak, by two pillars. One is newcomers to Canada, so any language programs that are funded by IRCC, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, so through settlement agencies, through community colleges. And then the second pillar has always been international students, right? So who would come to Canada, let's say they took the IELTS exam, but then their score wasn't high enough, so the university would still accept them under the condition that they have to complete academic English studies. And so I had experience, during my time as a grad student, like I said, I've been working almost from day one. So I've been teaching both newcomers in community settings as well as academic English to international students. I've done other types of tutoring and second language education. But then after the pandemic, a lot of things changed. So lots of international students were not allowed to come to Canada. And then shortly after the pandemic stopped, the government started signaling that, we're going to reduce funding for community-based classes. And so I realized that, since my background, my research was on community-based classrooms, so I actually designed a lot of materials specifically for language instruction for newcomers to Canada programs. But there is no way to become an assistant professor when you work for a link school, right? You would either worked there as a teacher, which I was kind of, I would say a bit overqualified, even though I don't believe in such things as overqualified when it comes to teaching a language, especially to adults. It's a very complex process. So I think the more education you have, the better. But what I'm trying to say is like, it kind of didn't make sense for me to have like a PhD degree and just go back to, like an entry level position. So then the other option was to work as an administrator, as a language, like as a program manager. And that was actually what brought me to Calgary. So at that time, I made the decision to pivot from academia into nonprofit. So that would allow me to kind of gain, experience in management, in, working in a different role as opposed to just an educator. But then things in the nonprofit didn't really go well because of the funding issues. And that what actually eventually prompted me to start my own school from scratch, because I realized that, I want to continue being a language educator, right? Like there's like hundreds of people who are still looking for language classes, especially above the survival level. And so for me to really, continue being fully employed and meaningfully employed in my sector, the only way for me was to actually start my own school. And that is essentially, I came to that realization that, that is what I was meant to do, in Canada, I think.
Oh, thank you so much for watching the podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule to be with us today. And I would like to take this quick moment to say thank you to all the people who are helping me out. Sergey with the visuals, Angelika with the social media marketing, and Intrinsic Innovation for providing us with this beautiful space. All the necessary links are in the comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, so please spread the love. And I highly encourage you to watch the episode until the end, because there's more interesting things that we'll be sharing today. Thank you. So what excites you about the school these days?
Mm-hmm. What excites me about the school is that I'm discovering, through working with my students, the more I work with students, the more I, interview new students who are coming in, is that I'm realizing that what we're creating at CELS is not just, a language class, it's the place where people actually feel that they belong in Canada, right? Because like I mentioned earlier, we are, when it comes to ESL classes, English as a second language, we don't accept people who have level 0 in English, right? Who are complete beginners, because for these folks, there's still some government funding left. So it's still possible to get some initial basic English through government funded schools. Where it becomes a problem is where people are, who have graduated from that basic level, right? And they're looking for, to advance their language proficiency. And so we offer intermediate, upper intermediate, and advanced level classes. And so by advanced level, I mean, most people would know probably like European framework, like C1, C2, which corresponds to Canadian language benchmarks 9, 10, 11, 12. So we actually have a class right now for advanced learners, and it's completely full. So which, at the beginning, I was surprised. Like I thought, why would people with already like a very strong upper intermediate level, why would they be looking for English classes like in a structured environment? They would be willing to pay for it. And now I realize that, really what's missing for a lot of folks who, immigrant professionals, right, who have achieved a strong CLB 8, which stands for upper intermediate, right, B2, is that sense of belonging where they feel like, technically, when I'm dealing, like when I work, let's say in the office, or like a lot of them are already employed in their professional fields, but let's say they're not being promoted, or they feel like they can't really have a small talk, with their colleagues. Like when it comes to just, their job duties, day-to-day duties, they're fine. Like they have enough language. But when it comes to really living in English, right, and becoming Canadian, and like identifying, I belong here now, even though I come from somewhere else, that's what's missing. And so we integrate that kind of content into our language training. And that's, I'm teaching one of the advanced sections right now, and that actually excites me the most. What excites me the least is teaching to the test, like preparing people for CELP IELTS, but thankfully I have very good instructors who specialize in these courses. So I don't personally teach. I mean, if I had to, I would do this for sure. And we, of course, offer exam preparation. But what excites me the most is, students who are taking language classes, whether it's ESL or French, just for the sake of improving their language and understanding Canadian culture and society on a deeper level.
Yeah. So I have a question about the society, but before that, you mentioned government-funded schools. And of course, funding changes and the programs change, but for the viewers that are just learning English, where they might benefit, how can they find which school is government-funded that they can benefit from that?
Oh, how they can know whether it's a government-funded. So the government-funded program is called LINK, Language Instruction for Newcomers to Canada. So let's say you're a newcomer to Canada, and we're talking here, it's important to specify that you must have a PR status, right? You must be a permanent resident or a conventional refugee in order to qualify for free programs from the government. So normally, you would go to like Immigrant Services Calgary or Center for Newcomers, like any of the big settlement agencies, and they would evaluate your level, and then they would recommend, a school for you. So like any link provider, right? Right now, of course, there is there is a huge waiting list, and like I mentioned, by the end of spring this year, there will be no levels 5 and 6. So everything above level 4, and this is again out of 12 levels, will be eliminated, unfortunately, in Canada. But yeah, like I said, but if you are a permanent resident or refugee and you're looking for basic English classes, the settlement agencies would be able to refer you.
Okay, excellent.
So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it's kind of a little segue, but for the people who want to learn. Yeah. So let's go back in terms of the becoming a true Canadian through language skills. Because to your point, it's hard to make friends when you're a bit afraid of speaking English because you're afraid that your grammatics may not be that correct or your accent is somewhere there. But what tips do you suggest to your students? Like, what are a couple of things that you could share with the audience here that can say, hey, do this and really help you improve and not overthink about it when you're speaking?
Yeah, not overthink is a very good point. Well, good question. So maybe we can, if we can break it down. Let's say a lot of students, right, whose first language is not English. Obviously, they're sometimes shy about their accent, or people have difficulty pronouncing certain words. So now we have to distinguish between, again, if you look at this from like a professional point of view, right, not an amateur point of view, but like as a second language educator, right, as somebody who studied applied linguistics for many years and read other experts in this area, right. So I would say we have to distinguish between accent reduction and just working on improving your pronunciation. So what we do in our classes is we don't work on accent reduction, okay? Because in most cases, it's simply biologically impossible to reduce your accent after the age of 15, unless you came to Canada at a very young age, then it's a different story. But yes, we do work, of course, on improving their pronunciation. So if you, for example, are struggling with pronouncing certain sounds or phonemes in English, then of course, when we look at new words, we integrate that into our classes. So the instructor, myself, or anyone on my team, right, like the instructor would correct, the instructor would explain, there's lots of different exercises we could do, but that has nothing to do with reducing or it has something to do with reducing your accent, of course, because the more clear you pronounce, right, the more, I guess, you will be comprehensible, but it doesn't mean that you will be able to completely get rid of your accent. So we don't do that, and we don't even emphasize that, right? Because what we emphasize instead is that we want people to understand that, Canada is a multicultural country, it's a country of immigrants. There are a lot of people here, even across Canada regionally, who have different accents. And you should be proud. I want my students to not to hide their heritage, to be proud of their heritage, and to highlight, their unique journey, their achievements. Of course, if they want to fully integrate into Canadian society, they have to be fluent in English. Like, there is no question, right? Understanding, instead of focusing on, reducing your accent or trying to sound like a native speaker, because first of all, statistically around the globe, there are more users of English as a second language who are non-native speakers than native speakers, right? And, nothing prevents these people from being successful and doing businesses internationally. But again, when you think of a native speaker is a very abstract concept, because even across Canada, we have a lot of, like I said, regional accents. So if you're trying to imitate someone, who are you trying to imitate? Somebody from Southern Alberta versus somebody from BC, right? So it's a waste of time. So instead, I always tell my students, you should, first of all, focus on improving your proficiency in the language. So the command of the language, which includes increasing your vocabulary, which means you need to read more.
And
right?
I would actually say read more, but also I read that it's also important to memorize, like poetry and when you're reading, to read out loud, so that
Yeah.
way it's when like it sticks more with you.
For sure. And here now we're entering the 4 skills, right? So again, a lot of students mistakenly think that, for example, when they ask them, like, what would you like to focus on? Like some students say, we only want to focus on speaking. Or some students will say, we only want to focus on grammar, right? And so we don't do isolated skills, like we do integrated skills, right? So by reading more, by listening more, let's say if you read more, you will become a better writer, right? If you listen more and try to memorize and like pay attention to how, what kind of expressions, for example, the speaker is using in this interview, right? You could also try to improve, you will improve your speaking, but it has to be, language is a communication tool, right? So we use all our 4 skills all the time at the same time, right? So when students say, we only want to, for example, the advanced students, right, would normally say, and these are very good students, right? They're very hardworking, and a lot of them are trying to achieve perfection, right? And they would say, I need to improve, like I need to learn more about grammar. And I tell them, at this level, trust me, you already know all the grammar you need. What you actually need to improve is your social cultural competence, the unspoken rules, the pragmatics, we call it in linguistics, right? Pragmatics, how to say things, in which context, when to shake hands, when not to shake hands.
Can you give a couple of examples of that?
Yeah, so for example, like a very typical example, like a textbook example would be when somebody says, so hi, how are you, right? So they're normally not looking for like an elaborate answer. They're just looking for a cliche response, like I'm good and you, how was your weekend? Was great, thanks, right?
Yeah.
But in order for you to know that, you actually need to know the unspoken rules of the Canadian English culture, right?
So how can a person who doesn't know those unspoken rules understand them? What tips would you give to those?
First of all, that takes years to understand. Okay, so we also know from research that it may take up to 10 years in the new environment to actually understand these unspoken rules, but you also have to be actively participating in the society.
So actively participating by...
Yeah, by like getting out of your cultural bubble, by taking risks, by trying to make friends who don't speak your first language, right? So, and these people do not necessarily have to be native speakers of English, or how my students say native Canadians. And I tell them the only native Canadians are Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. Everyone else is, a settler, right? Yeah. So anyone who speaks English, proficiently, it can be, of course, a native speaker of English, perfect. It's always great to have that practice, but it can be anyone like myself or yourself, right? Who have reached a very high level in proficiency, and being curious about the culture, being curious to learn what's going on, like, for example, politically, what's going on economically, who is the mayor of Calgary? Did you know that there were elections, we had elections last year? Mm-hmm. What's happening, for example, with the signature collection, what are Canadians talking about, so things like, so being, really curious, right, about, Canadian authors, for example, right? Like Margaret Atwood, like we give them, for example, in the advanced level course, we give them short stories, right? There is like a whole layer of culture, and then there's also French Canadian culture, which is like another layer, and then there is Indigenous. So actually understanding these things and genuinely caring about them, I would say would be the tip I would give to my students, right? So don't focus too much on the grammar, because when it comes to grammar, nobody really knows, all the rules, right? Unless you're like a linguist at the university level, but focus more on, for example, idiomatic expressions, right? Because a lot of students are struggling when it comes to idiomatic expressions. So just last night we were listening to a CTV interview, right, with it has to do with, Alberta separation movement, but I try to, include all the authentic materials, like what's happening right now. And so the speaker was using, like, every second sentence he was producing contained a formulaic expression. For example, like, it's not in the cards right now, or like, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Mm-hmm. So things like these are called idiomatic expressions. And so, and like, this is what you want to know at that advanced level, because this is how native or proficient speakers communicate. And so, yes, it takes, time, exposure. Of course, taking structured classes, like going to like a school where, in a professional setting, the instructor will highlight these things for you, right? Kind of say, okay, do you understand the meaning? Let's check the dictionary. So we create this opportunity for people, but you don't necessarily have to actually go to a language class to, once you already have this upper intermediate level, you can just go and do your own research. You can, talk to ChatGPT, right? Like there are lots of tools.
Urban Dictionary, something I find. Like
Like you can lots of tools where you can just ask questions, like say, okay, now I don't understand, like Google it, and you'll but again, like people are busy. I understand that not everyone has the time and resources to like, in a disciplined manner to like allocate 2 hours a week every day to do it. So when, we create this opportunity for them. And also another thing, what excites me about CELS, going back to the question, is that I definitely see that we create the community. And that's why we offer both online and in-person classes. So of course, in person, if you're in Calgary, and our in-person classes are very popular. I would say like 70% of students prefer in person. I mean, unless they're not in Calgary, then they're only option. And we do have students from outside of Calgary. I even have one student who is in Mexico, but we met in Calgary last year, and now she's back in Mexico, but she's taking an online class with us. But the majority of students who are based in Calgary prefer in person. And when you ask them why, because from the pedagogical perspective, we use the same materials, right? Like it's the same activities, but they say because we want to meet other people, like because we want to see how others are learning, exchange information, so it creates a community.
And do you make sure that the community is comprised of people with different backgrounds?
For sure, yeah. So like I said earlier, I was born and raised in Ukraine, came to Canada 14 years ago. So of course I have a lot of Ukrainian students for obvious reasons, and people know me in the community. But when I started the school, I said from the get-go, like I'm going to create a multicultural language training center to really immerse students into what Canada is. And Canada is multicultural, and we have different accents. Sometimes students say, I learned English, let's say in Ukraine or in France, and now I hear like Indian English accent, or I hear, Latino accent, right? And so people say, well, it's difficult for me to get used to it. And I always tell them, but that's, you have to train your ear, because these are going to be your future colleague, your neighbors. And so, we are definitely very multicultural. Yeah.
That's good. And to your point, if you understand the accents on the get-go, you're easier to communicate with those people, and you understand their cultures, and then you integrate better because you can celebrate each other's holidays. Because I find that one of the other challenges that people have is that they don't celebrate each other's holidays. Yes, they moved to Canada, but they're not celebrating the holidays that people typically celebrate here. And thus, how can you integrate into society if you're not even taking part in those processes?
That's the beauty of Canada. Like I learned Spanish. I mean, I'm not extremely fluent in Spanish, but I do have a functional intermediate level. And I learned it here in Canada. Like I didn't have to go to Mexico to learn. I mean, I eventually went and traveled. I visited Mexico several times, but there are so many native speakers of, for example, Mexican Spanish or Colombian Spanish here, like in Calgary, that you don't even have to go somewhere far away to actually practice with native speakers. Like right now I'm learning French, right? And so through our French instructors, I'm being introduced to the Francophone community. And, you have Francophones from Quebec, you have Francophones from France, you have Francophones from like different African countries, and everyone has their own accent. But they're all here. Like if you actually want to learn. So another thing that I would say, another tip that I would give to students, and it's very simple. Language can only be learned through exposure. Okay, a language class, like a formal language class, is absolutely helpful, but it's absolutely not enough. Especially if you only have time to attend a class 2 hours, 4 hours a week, right? So we do, of course, assign homework, for example, right? But nothing can replace authentic communication in the real world context, not in the structured classroom kind of sheltered environment. Still, it's not the same as actually practicing, under the pressure of real communication. So look for opportunities, more opportunities to expose yourself. Let's say if you're learning English, right? A lot of people are, there's a challenge for a lot of my students where they say, I don't have enough practice in English because like at work, I'm surrounded by speakers of my first language, which is not surprising because, right, in Canada, you can always find community, right, like from your first country. And it is your comfort zone, and I understand why, and it's also a survival mechanism for many people. And I don't blame people, I understand why they're doing it. But at the same time, if you really want to become part of the multicultural mosaic, you need to get out there and, and meet people from so many different countries. Like it's amazing that Canada can offer this. It's very unique. We're in a very unique place, I think.
So in terms of, like you mentioned, tools, let's just kind of sum up the tools that a person needs to use to learn a language. So you mentioned schools, so that's one of the tools. Before we started filming, we talked about Duolingo. That could be another additional tool.
Or any other apps. Like there are more. There is so many.
Duolingo is just kind of a more, let's say, an umbrella term in this scenario.
Yeah.
Then we talked about going out. What other tool can a person utilize to be able to have their language a bit more proficient? Or maybe I can even rephrase that and say, a person who wants a professional career here and wants to develop and may find that language is something that is stopping them, and maybe it's psychological, maybe it's like they're in their own head because of that. But what tip would you give them to help them get through that and understand that what they have is already sufficient for them to get those promotions, and that they should not be afraid of speaking, especially speaking up at meetings? Because I find personally in a professional corporate environment here, the more you speak at a meeting, the more people will recognize you, will see you, even if you're saying something that is not groundbreaking, but still, the more you participate, the more people will value as a team player.
So I would say, a lot of successful immigrants I've met who've mastered English, let's say, as their second language to a very high level. Most of them, what they share in common is that they have completed some sort of education here. It doesn't have to be like a master's or PhD degree, but it could be like a micro-credential, could be like a professional development course. And it doesn't have to be called ESL course, right? Like I'm talking about professional courses related to your career, right? Because when you start exposing yourself to these kind of courses, right, like you will inevitably be forced to read more, to listen more, to write more, right? And you will be exposed to the advanced level English, right? Advanced level language that is useful for your career. But then it's not enough just to collect those and put that on your resume, right? Like you actually have to establish connections with your team, to make sure people like you, right, understand you, so you can actually talk about something casual. That's, like I said, the very common challenge that people come to us with is, I don't understand how Canadians do small talk, what is the purpose of small talk? Like, what am I supposed to discuss, right? I don't understand, what are the safe topics, right? And so for that, again, watching shows, like what's, for example, on Crave, I don't know, Heated Rivalry, everyone is talking about Heated Rivalry. So when I ask my students, do you know what the show is about? And most students said, like last week, no, we never heard about it, right? But this is what people are talking about. So, so like I said, being, eventually what it comes down to is once you reach that level where you are fully immersed into the local context and culture and pop culture, right? Pop culture, very important, not just academic, not just professional technical language, but pop culture, social media, which platform you're using. There is a difference also in terms of who is, for example, on Facebook versus who is on TikTok. But are you using your social media in English? Like, are you following English content creators, or are you following your first culture, right? Like in your first language. So that is another question, right? Because this is free language exposure, right? You don't have to pay. You can just click on the channel. Now I lost the train of thought. But anyways, to summarize, it comes down to developing a second or an additional identity, right? So I'm not saying that you should abandon who you are, like your first language, your first culture, because, unless you want to completely change your identity, change your name, make it a more Anglophone name. But in most cases, people still want to preserve their first culture. But what happens is that you have to be able to switch between these two identities. And depending on who you talk to, you're going to react or behave in a different way. So that is what I tell my students as well, right? Like you have to start living in English, thinking in English. Like, are you thinking in English? Or are you thinking in your first language? For example, in my case, I think in English. So when I speak Russian or Ukrainian, I realize that it's not, these languages are not anymore, I'm not that fluent anymore because I'm translating some of my expressions
from English.
From English. And it's, it is what it is, right? It's hard to be absolutely fluent equally in multiple languages, but immigration is a conscious step. Like if you have decided, I'm going to make this my new home, this is what I have to do, because otherwise I'm never going to feel like I belong. I'm always going to feel like, this is me in my community versus the rest of them, right? But you don't want to be in that situation. You want to be in a situation where you say, this is my home or my second home and I'm at home here. Yeah.
So you mentioned pop culture. I guess, especially for Canada, sports is another good, safe topic.
Yeah, for sure.
Just especially hockey and...
Don't ask me any terms though, because I don't follow hockey.
there's a little bit of a distinction between casual topics and then topics that are when you're oversharing. And sometimes there's a little bit of a nuance, especially for a newcomer, because in their original culture, it could be a bit of a different, scenario, what is considered oversharing and what is considered casual. What kind of tips would you give them to know, or like what kind of subjects would you suggest people should keep to keep it casual? And what subjects do you think that are already leaning towards oversharing that you should try to avoid, especially let's say at a networking event or with a person that you have just met, because you don't want to, give them too much information about your personal life.
Yeah, good question. So first of all, I wanted to mention right away that let's say we have a class at CELS called Business English. And so a very important component of that class would be focusing on cultural differences. For example, how we give feedback or how we, persuade others, right? Or express our opinion. So, and we emphasize very clearly, this is how you say it, for example, in a more direct way versus in a more indirect way. And this is Canadian culture. We value this, this, and this. So, for example, what I'm trying to say is that with these kind of nuances, like capturing these cultural differences, actually taking a professional class like language and culture and workplace culture class can be very helpful, because a lot of these things are not on the surface. And so some people can figure them out by themselves just by noticing and observing. And some people might be living here for like years and years and they're still not getting these unspoken rules. So unless somebody explicitly points that out. So that is, for example, that would be the value of programs we offer, right? Because like to watch news in English, you don't need to come to my class. You can just turn on the TV. Yeah. But like for somebody to break it down for you. But then going back to your question, like oversharing, good question. So during networking events, like what I learned, for example, like in the trainings I've taken, right? Or when you are talking to potential, employers, recruiters, or somebody who may know someone, right? You don't want to overload them with like your entire history of your working experience, right? Because it has to be about the other person, not about you, right? So you have to ask more questions about them and just like react to respond and say, me too, like I've been there before as well, right? Just again, this is the art of small talk, right? And it's easy on the surface, but it's not that easy in practice, right? But it has to be, again, when we go to networking events, the idea is not to apply for jobs on the spot. The idea is to make connections, but also follow up with these people, right? Because I've had, unfortunately, quite a few times where I've spoken to newcomers, not only from my own home country, but from other countries where, people would give me their, not their resume, their business card. I'm thinking about resumes. And I would like email them later, right? And then I never heard back from them. So then I thought, what was the point of even giving me this business card? Like I'd rather we actually establish like a human connection and just learn more about each other on a human level before we start talking about business. So, sometimes you can just walk out with a bunch of business cards, but it doesn't end in anything. But also, I would say like even, again, going back to Canadian environment, multiculturalism, right? So at the networking event, you are inevitably going to run into people from a lot of different countries, like who immigrated here. So learn more about their culture, because people love when you care, when you ask questions about their traditions, their language, their food, right? Yeah. And so they feel like, you care about them. So I would say, don't overthink it, be casual, and avoid, in terms of language, avoid any technical terms from your industry, right? Because again, acronyms, yeah, because it like, ESP, for example, used to stand for English for specific purposes, like when I was a grad student, but then we learned that ESP also means something else, like in banking versus engineering. So avoid acronyms, avoid technical language, and just try to find out more about that person who's in front of you. What's their background, what interests them, like why are they here, right? And things like that, just human level, I would say.
And I really like that example because for two things, follow-up, extremely important. I always say that to people. You go to a networking event, if you don't follow up, why did you spend your time there? Like it was pointless, like you're not getting any benefit. And the second thing is, in terms of when you're talking to a person, I always say never ask for a job there, because that will only make that person less or more reluctant to help you. That it will distract that person. But when you ask the person, hey, like I saw your career path, it's amazing, and I'm in banking myself, for example, and I would really like to learn about how you went through your career. Can you share some tips and whatnot? That will make that person more open to helping you, and then engaging you with that person's network, and that way you can get more people, you can learn, and you can grow, and thus find a job. Because if you're going to a networking event, especially with thinking, yes, I'm going to get a job, you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah. And also, it takes time to establish trust,
Yes.
right? Especially if you're new to Canada, right? So, the biggest challenge is not, it might not in most cases, not in all cases, but in most cases is not, the English level, is the lack of network, right? And it takes years. Even if, when I moved from Ottawa to Calgary, I didn't know anyone here except for my immediate colleagues at the job I had at that time. And so it took me several years and I keep working on establishing this network, right? And I'm so grateful that, we met through a mutual connection. So, and it takes time. It doesn't mean that, the moment we met, we, immediately decided, oh, let's, record a podcast. Like you need to establish trust. You need to show up to meetings. You need to respond to emails, right? Like you need to, if you give me your business card, right? And I'm emailing you, please respond to the email. Email communication is another thing that I see. There's a big cultural difference in terms of how, some cultures kind of prefer instant communication, and Canadian professional culture is most cases going to be email.
Yep.
And so again, I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that this is how we prefer, how things are done here. And so yes, it takes time to establish this trust, to earn this trust. And so that is why, the follow-up piece is super important. Because otherwise you're just scrolling through, your feed, and you don't remember who is who, their names, right? But, and as you're following up, as you're responding to these emails, I've had instances, for example, again, speaking as a language teacher, as a second language educator, where I'm, let's say I share the same first language with my student, right? Let's say it's a Ukrainian student. And I would write a follow-up email in English, because I always use English when it's professional communication as part of the school. Even if I speak that first language, or I can speak Spanish, I would never use that first language unless it's an emergency or some person is crying in my office. Of course, I'm going to switch. But if it's a professional communication, I use this as an opportunity to expose them more and more to English. And sometimes I find people respond to me in their first language. I'm talking to them in English, and they're responding to me in, let's say, Russian or Ukrainian. And I always think, but why? This is a chance for you to practice. And I know your English is not perfect, but I'm not going to judge you. This is, no
safe
judgment.
Space, yeah.
Safe space, yeah. But so respond, right? In English. So as you do these follow-ups, right, this is your opportunity to practice. This is all these steps count. But I mean, it's not easy. And, life is challenging right now, right? That people are sometimes working several jobs. But yes, if you're looking for professional career, to build a professional career, to build your network, it's hard work. It takes time, and you need to be consistent. Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of go on the note of the emails, because email communication, to your point, yes, it's very important here in Canada, but I find that it's a bit more casual than in some other places. For example, when I used to work back home, the emails were you really thought out how
That's
to.
a good point.
Then the other thing is when I was learning English, one of the courses I had was commercial English. So they prepared us how to write letters and how to write emails in English. And I remember, you always start your email with "Dear Mr. Someone" or something like that.
Or "Dear Sir, Madam."
Or "Dear Sir, Madam." And then if you start with "Sir, Madam," at the end you say "faithfully yours." And if you start with a name, at the end you say "sincerely yours."
Yeah,
and, those kind of changes. And here people are like, "Hey, Samir,"
"Hey, folks."
"Hey, folks." And the
Cheers.
email is much simpler. So although people do prefer the email communication is not as formal as you would see in the textbooks.
Right.
So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how to be successful, especially in corporate environment. What tips would you give for people when they're writing their emails?
Yeah, good question. Speaking of textbooks, we don't even use textbooks at my school at all. I mean, we might use like certain chapters from certain sources, but we never ask our students to purchase any textbooks. The reason why is like there is no single textbook that is up to date, right? So instead we use like in the business English class, we would give them an article from a LinkedIn. Or like I could give them, for example, this interview as a listening source, right? And then we can have a discussion. So we don't even use, we create our own authentic materials based on what's out there. But then in terms of emails, so first of all, I would say it's a very good question. And this just highlights that, again, language is learned in context, right? And it all depends on the context of communication. So formal versus informal, what kind of language you use for more formal, what kind of language you use for less formal. What is formal in Calgary, Alberta might not be as formal in Texas, US, for example, right? So it depends on the regional culture, and also of the country, of the province, for example, but also the workplace culture of that organization. So I would usually say, and I think like, HR specialists would probably agree, right? Like you always have to observe what is the culture of that organization. Like, if they're giving you any onboarding materials, like you pay attention to how other colleagues are communicating, like your boss, for example, does the boss prefer a more formal style? Maybe then you adjust to a more formal because that is how they're used to communicate in that particular environment. Like, for example, if you're in banking versus you're in oil and gas versus you're in the nonprofit. So these are very different workplace cultures. Like there are some similarities, but there still will be different. So you have to, and it's challenging, right? Because you have to like read between the lines. You have to see all these layers. But where the language piece comes in, the actual the technical kind of nitty-gritty language part is that you have to understand how to adjust your phrase, what, for example, grammar and vocabulary tools you need to use in order to make your request more formal or more casual, right? So, and that is where we, for example, as language school, as language teachers, that's where we can help them, right? Because sometimes people confuse like would versus will, should versus can, right? And so there we, but we'll always show them the examples of these, for example, modal verbs in the context of an email. But I would say, just to summarize, look at the workplace culture of that organization and the team who surrounds you, what their background is, right, and things like that.
Excellent, thank you. We are coming up to our time, but I have two last quick questions. First of all, with a lot of developments happening, and especially when we're talking about technological developments, AI, and all those things, what trends are you seeing today that can impact language studies in the future, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I see the rise of AI tools, apps, AI tutors, right, that are claiming to be replacing real tutors, like human teachers, where, so I see a lot of ads, for example, on YouTube for things like that. And it's fine. I mean, I think it's inevitable, right? Like, ChatGPT can do a lot of things. Like just the other day, I was using Notebook LM, which is part of Google Suite, where it can create, I actually use it for my own classes. Like sometimes I create podcasts based on articles, and why not? Like, it's all good source of language input. So I do see a lot of course, things like Duolingo and other apps. But what I also predict is that people are still looking for people, right? So, and when you're learning a language, you want to talk to to a real human being, right? Because again, it's not just grammar, vocabulary, it's the culture, it's, the connection, right? It's the trust. And so, I don't expect that, human, like physical classrooms with human teachers, will be easily replaced by AI, or if at all. I think people will still be, if they're those who will be able to afford it, like financially and time-wise and commitment-wise to actually come to a physical class, will still prefer doing that. As teachers, as educators, we of course should learn how to use these tools. Because if you're completely ignorant, you think, let's say I can create like a podcast or PowerPoint within 3 minutes, instead of me just spending like weeks like I used before. So that does make sense. Of course, I'm going to utilize it. But I, as an expert, because remember, ChatGPT is not an expert. ChatGPT did not spend 7 years in grad school. Right now, we know people who are looking for medical advice for various reasons, right, in ChatGPT, and then they're arguing with medical doctors, saying, "No, I don't trust you because that's what ChatGPT gave me." So, I am as an expert, I know how to ask questions, right? And so depending how you pose that question, the result will be different, right? So as a language expert, right, like as somebody who knows what I'm doing in my classroom, what tools I'm using, what is going to be helpful, how to design a program, right? Because it has to be not just a random selection of lessons. There is like learning outcomes. Usually we, for example, offer courses that stretch over like 12-week period. So there is like learning objectives. There's a logic behind it. So I'm using AI to give me what I need to achieve my goal. But AI doesn't know what my goal is. So if I don't want AI to tell me what my goal is, I need to be in charge of AI, not the other way around.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, and it goes back to garbage in, garbage out. So if you're giving them bad commands, you're going to get bad results.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And the last question I want to ask you is some last minute wisdom, let's say. What would be one key takeaway that you think our users, or not viewers, should go after this interview with? What would be one key takeaway for them that they need to remember?
So, and I would imagine most of our viewers are in Canada.
In Canada, maybe in the US and North America, but the assumption is that most of us are immigrants who are watching.
I would say just be curious. Always ask more questions. Be curious and look beyond the cliche answers and cliche solutions, right? Remember that there is always a path. If you're looking to achieve real results and real impact, right? It's not a linear path. It's not just 1, 2, 3 checkbox. It's always a lot of hard work. It's asking uncomfortable questions to yourself and challenging your own beliefs, right? And trying to get outside of your comfort zone or stereotypical perception, right, of the world. So be curious and keep learning nonstop. Never stop.
Thank you. I really appreciated taking the time to chat with me today. I'm sure our audience will enjoy this conversation. Yeah. And language skills is so important for immigrants, and not being afraid to speak and practice is important. So thank you for sharing all that information with us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Samir.
Thank you.